This screencast is on normative basis. This is one of the more complicated terms that's here in the first chapter, so I thought it would be a good idea to spend a little bit of time kind of working our way through it. So first off, what is a normative basis? Well, first we look at this word normative. What normative means is pertaining to some kind of rule. Okay, so if something is normative, it's a rule that a group of people or a whole lot of people ought to follow. And a basis is a framework or structure that's at the base of things, that's at the core of things. So a normative basis is saying that there are some moral ideas, some moral concepts that are normative, right, that all people ought to follow in some way, and that can be the foundation, in a sense, for all the moral reasoning that we're going to be doing later on. Basically, it's saying there's some things that, regardless of your society, regardless of where you come from, that you're going to agree on as far as morality is concerned. Now, your book comes up with, in this first chapter, 4 candidates for the normative basis. We'll flesh this out a lot more in subsequent chapters, but let's just go through those real quick here. So the candidates for a normative basis are beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And these are traditionally in medical ethics classic core principles of medical ethics. So the first principle is beneficence. The principle of beneficence is that you ought to do good to other people. So you ought to basically treat other people as you would treat yourself, and you should try to be as good to other people as you can possibly be. This is one of the absolutely most core terms in ethics. And we can trace it back to St. Thomas Aquinas in the 12th and 13th century, when he said, do good and avoid evil is the core principle of the natural law, which in a sense is another way of saying normative basis. So that's beneficence. The next is non-maleficence. First, do no harm. This is one of the core principles from the Hippocratic Oath, which is the oath that doctors and medical professionals take before they enter into the practice of medicine. It's an oath that's been around since the ancient Greeks, and one of the first principles of this is that as a medical practitioner, you should do your best not to harm your patient. Autonomy is the idea that an individual has the right to self-determination whenever that self-determination is possible. So an individual has the right to make decisions about their own care and about the kinds of things that are going to be done to them. So for example, in medical ethics, autonomy is a really interesting issue because a lot of times individuals have one idea about what kind of care they should receive, and their doctors, their family, and various other people have other ideas. And this will be at the core of a lot of the moral issues we talk about later on. The next principle is the principle of justice. Justice is equity between people as individuals, as communities, and as a society. So for justice, it's the idea that you should have equality, fairness, fair access to resources, fair distribution of things, at least an equal shot at things. And so when we start to talk about things like healthcare reform or like the way that our society deals with healthcare, justice is going to be a major part of the conversation. Okay, so we've got these 4 core moral principles, and what you'll see is that a lot of our other principles in medical ethics will be built off of these principles. But there's a challenge to this, and that's the challenge from a philosophical position called moral relativism. Moral relativism is the philosophical position that says that there really are no moral rules that can be applied across the board, and that morality is really just dependent upon the person. So basically, when I say something's good, if I'm a relativist, the relativist would say that I'm saying it's good for me, and that I have no basis to say that it's good for somebody else. What that means is that I can't make moral decisions or moral determinations about other people. I can only make them for myself. What a normative basis says is that there is a core truth to ethics, and there are some things that are good, and there are some things that are bad. And so when I make a decision morally, I can make a decision that applies to other people, and we can have moral rules that apply across the board. Relativism is on the rise, especially in 20th century philosophy. It's a major idea in our culture. Pope Benedict talked about it during one of the masses that he gave after John Paul II's death. And Benedict says, we are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate standard consists solely of one's own ego and desires. What it's saying there is that relativism says there is nothing that's at the core, and the only standard is what I personally feel, what I personally want to be true. So how do you argue against relativism? Well, here's a couple of arguments. Number one is the argument from common ideals. If you look across cultures, what you'll find is even though sometimes practices may be a little different, the ideals, the core pieces of that normative basis, things like beneficence and non-maleficence, autonomy and justice, are pretty much there throughout cultures. There's a great book by the Christian author C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book called The Abolition of Man, where he goes into, in an appendix to the book, he goes into the moral codes from about a dozen different cultures, and he finds things that tie all of these moral codes together. Things like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You find that in Hinduism, you find it in Buddhism. Heck, you even found it about 100 years before Jesus in Judaism, when the Rabbi Hillel said, what you would not wish to done to yourself, do not do to your neighbor. So it's a common ideal, it's a common thread. And so we could say that that means that at least that principle, that what you want done to yourself should be done to somebody else, is something that should be universal. The other piece is that real relativism is unworkable. If you're a moral relativist, then you can't make moral decisions about anybody else or about anyone else's actions. So when we're looking at the case studies and all of the ideas we're going to be talking about in this class, a moral relativist approach would be that every individual is just making their own decision and they can't decide one way or another whether there is something morally right or wrong here. The fact is, we make moral decisions all the time. We say that certain things are right and that certain things are wrong. One of the challenges that relativism brings up is the idea of looking at the relationship between social norms and natural law. Now, basically, the relativist is right to point out that different societies at different times in different periods of history have different social norms, have different ideas about what's right and wrong. So, for example, in the Victorian era, women were basically not allowed to talk about sex. They had to dress very conservatively, and that was considered prudent. And if a woman was showing a little bit of ankle, that was considered to be salacious, right? That was like putting yourself out there. Today, our norms about chastity and modesty are a little bit different. Okay. Where we don't see showing a little bit of ankle as risque. Now, here's the thing. Did our culture's value on chastity and modesty change? Or did we just change the definition in our culture of what it means to be chaste or modest? I would argue that it's still a good thing for people to be modest, and it's a good thing for people to practice chastity. But some of the ways that we practice it are a little bit different today than they were 100 years ago. And a lot of that's cultural. This is an argument that's made by C.S. Lewis again in his book Mere Christianity. He has a really nice chapter on chastity where he talks about exactly this issue. The other piece about relativism is its practicality. The problem with relativism is that if you're an extreme moral relativist, you can't really stand up for anything. So if you want to say something like, the Nazis were wrong to kill 6 million Jews in the concentration camps, unfortunately you can't say that when you were a relativist. If you're a moral objectivist who's basing their reasoning on a normative basis, then you can make those kinds of claims. So that's a reason to have a normative basis. The next step is to figure out what our normative basis is. And that's what we're going to be doing a few videos from now when we enter into Chapter 2.